I'm going to be talking to you guys today about the relationships between language and non-linguistic cognition. And so I thought an appropriate place to start would be talking about what non-linguistic cognition might be. And so when I say that, when I say cognition just more generally, what I'm talking about are things like attention, memory, our categorization abilities, analogical reasoning, things like that. Basically, that whole host of things we do mentally from a moment-to-moment basis all day long with or without the aid of language. The reason I'm interested in this area of research, the reason that so many people are interested in it, is because for a long time, for about 50 years now, there has been a big debate in the fields of linguistics and psychology over whether or not there is, in fact, any relationship between language and broader cognition at all. All right? And for a long time, many have thought that language is isolated away from the rest of cognition. And if not language as a whole, parts of language, maybe the grammar, for example. And just as a classic example of this, Steven Pinker famously observed that there is a double dissociation between language on the one hand and general intelligence abilities on the other hand. And so this is what I mean by a double dissociation. If you take, for example, children who have specific language impairment, this is a genetically inheritable impairment specifically in language abilities, we find that children with specific language impairment tend to have poor language abilities, but their intelligence is within the normal population range. So with Williams syndrome, if you take children who have Williams syndrome, they have below the normal range in terms of intelligence abilities, but their language abilities are in the normal range, or if anything, those children are quite verbose. So what Steven Pinker observed was that we have this double dissociation. As language abilities go up and down on the one hand, intelligence abilities don't seem to kind of do anything systematic with it on the other hand. And so this observation and many other observations like it have been made for about 50 years or so in a more traditional generative approach to language. And in this approach, language is modular. It's isolated away from the rest of cognition. That means that the parts of our brain that we use, or the cognitive abilities that we use for certain parts of language, are argued to be used for that part of language or for language only and nothing else, right? No other cognitive abilities are getting involved here. This has variously been called different things over the years. It's been called a universal grammar or a language organ or a language acquisition device. Whatever you might call it, there's definitely some merit to this view, as Pinker's arguments make clear. Language in many cases does seem to be different somehow from the rest of our cognitive abilities. And some things that go on in language look drastically different from things that go on in other areas of cognition. So for example, subject-verb agreement. Where do you see that in other aspects of cognition? Right? Not too many places. Why do we have these kinds of things in language and not in other places? So for a long time, people have had this sort of view. More recently, I would say within the last 20 years or so, people have started to kind of push back against this view for a variety of reasons. For me personally, one of the biggest reasons why I've pushed back against this view is simply because it's very difficult to establish empirically. It's very difficult to show with some sort of experiment or some sort of study that some part of language is unrelated to every different possible cognitive ability we might have. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of cognitive abilities, right? And in order to show that language doesn't rely on any of them, or some aspect of language doesn't rely on any of them, we have to go through and compare someone's abilities on that part of language with their cognitive abilities, every single one of them, and exhaustively test them all. Now, that sounds very difficult, if not impossible, to me. And so I decided that when I started doing research, I wanted to take a different approach. Whether the ultimate truth is that language is somewhat separate from the rest of cognition, or somewhat related, or entirely one or the other. I wanted to take a different approach because it was more experimentally doable for me. The approach that I start with is assuming that language is a new machine made out of mostly or entirely old parts. All right? And that assumption may or may not be right, but it's the sort of starting point for the kinds of research that I do and that many other people do. On this approach, we try to gather our evidence by thinking about people's general cognitive abilities and thinking how those cognitive abilities work and whether or not anything similar happens in language. So in order to show some sort of relationship between these general cognitive abilities and language, we need to establish some sort of relationship, ideally a causal one, but we'll accept a correlational relationship to start. We need to show some sort of relationship, though, between some sort of non-linguistic function and some sort of language function. And just to give you guys a few examples of what I mean, today I'm going to be talking about the relationships between declarative and procedural memory abilities on the one hand, and language abilities on the other hand. I'll be talking about this primarily because it's most of the research that I've been doing in the past few years. So before I go into this too much, though, I should probably clarify what I mean by declarative memory abilities and procedural memory abilities. So to start with, let's go with declarative memory. Okay? Declarative memory is one of our long-term memory systems in the brain, and it actually is comprised by several subsystems. Two of the most well-known and most well-understood are episodic memory and semantic memory. Now, episodic memory is what most people think of when they think about memory. Episodic memory are those little videos that you can play back in your mind of your own life. Right? It's those own events that you have from your own life that you can pull up pretty much at any time, and sometimes they just pop up for no apparent reason. All right? These are episodes from your life, and we call them episodic memories. That's one kind of declarative memory. The other kind of declarative memory is semantic memory. And semantic memory is what we use to learn and retain general information and facts about the world. For example, Columbus is the capital of Ohio, and Cleveland is a really, really awesome place to be. So, with semantic memory and episodic memory, we form together declarative memory. And we look at declarative memory and we ask ourselves, is it possible that declarative memory might have anything to do with language? All right? Well, if you think about what declarative memory does and what it's specialized for, you start to see some possible relationships. So on the one hand, declarative memory appears to be specialized for the really rapid learning of arbitrary relationships. All right? And when you think about that and you ask yourself, I wonder if language has any rapidly learned arbitrary relationships. You should think, bingo, words. Words are, of course, a very important part of language, and words are essentially rapidly learned arbitrary relationships. We know that words are rapidly learned both in children and adults as a general rule. We see giant vocabulary spurts in children. We see that adults can pick up new words quite quickly and easily as a general rule. And importantly, words are arbitrary relationships. They are arbitrary relationships between some kind of meaning on the one hand and some kind of form on the other. And when I say form, I mean written or spoken or signed. And we put these arbitrary relations together. We can pick them up quite quickly. And so we think maybe declarative memory, which is specialized for this kind of rapid learning of arbitrary relationships, maybe that has something to do with word learning. So we've got to test it. Now, how do we test it? Well, we can do so with a variety of methodologies. Several researchers have looked at neuropsychological cases. These are people who have some sort of lesions on their brain or some sort of brain damage. What we find is that when certain patients have brain damage to areas of their brain that are important for declarative memory, they're also impaired at new word learning, suggesting some sort of relationship between declarative memory and word learning. But what we also notice is that those same patients often don't have trouble remembering words that they already know, suggesting that maybe the role of declarative memory is in the learning process with words more so than with the retention or long-term storage of those. It's a lot messier than that, but you get the idea. We also get evidence from neuroimaging, in which case we find that the parts of the brain that light up when you're doing some sort of non-linguistic declarative memory task in a brain scanner, for example, an fMRI, we see that the areas of the brain that light up for declarative memory also light up for word learning. Again, we're talking about things like the hippocampus and medial temporal lobes. If you like to know specifics there, that's what we're talking about. Finally, we can also get our evidence from behavioral correlations. Now, this is where a lot of my research comes in. With the behavioral correlations, what we do is we measure people's declarative memory abilities on the one hand, using a bunch of different kinds of tasks in our lab, and then we measure their word learning abilities on the other hand. And what we want to see is if people's declarative memory improves or declines, we want to see if their language abilities also improve and decline as well. We want to see if there's a positive correlation between the two. And as a general rule, that's what we find. Importantly, we find it both in first language acquisition in children, and we also find it in second language acquisition in adults. So, overall, it looks like declarative memory and word learning share some sort of common cognitive processes. Now, it could be that we use our declarative memory to learn new words, or it could be somehow that our word learning abilities are also supportive of our declarative memory. What I mean is we can't tell which direction this relationship goes in or how exactly it all works out, but that's something we're still working on. All right, now that's declarative memory. I also promised you guys procedural memory. How does that work? Well, procedural memory as an overall memory system is specialized for the learning of cognitive and motor routines or sequences. It appears to be specifically specialized for learning sequential or combinatorial information. So for example, learning how to ride a bike or drive a manual transmission car or maybe play a guitar. Usually these things involve at some point, especially at higher levels of proficiency, some sort of procedural memory ability. Now, we should be asking ourselves, just like we did with declarative memory, what does this procedural memory system have to do with language, if anything? Where are there some similarities? Well, our procedural memory, as I said, is specialized for learning sequences, and so sequential aspects of language we might expect would be also related to procedural memory, or at least it's possible. So, is it? That's what we tested to see. So again, looking at neuropsychological evidence, we can look to see whether or not people who have impairments in their language abilities or their procedural memory abilities also have impairments in the other. For example, going back to the specific language impairment example that I gave earlier, we see that children who have specific language impairment quite often have impairments in grammatical aspects of language, which of course involve a lot of sequencing words together, right? But we also see that those same children with specific language impairment tend to have procedural memory impairments as well, again, suggesting some sort of relationship between the two. We also find from neuroimaging research, recent neuroimaging research, that areas of the brain that are particularly important for procedural memory are also active specifically with grammar learning in language, but not with word learning, suggesting that, again, procedural memory might be playing a role in sequential aspects of language, like rules that combine words into sequences, but not specifically word learning itself. So it looks like maybe procedural learning has something to do with grammatical abilities in language, anything involving combinations or rules. Finally, we also have a variety of behavioral evidence looking at correlations between individual differences in procedural memory abilities on the one hand and language abilities on the other hand. What we find here is that as people's procedural memory improves, their grammar learning tends to improve. As their procedural memory declines, their grammar learning abilities also tend to decline. We see this in first language situations and second language situations, but the available evidence that we have suggests that this relationship looks like it's stronger in second language contexts. And we're not exactly sure why this is, but it's an avenue of research that we're currently pursuing. So, big picture, let's step back. What have we been saying so far? Well, we're wondering whether or not certain non-linguistic cognitive abilities, like memory, play some sort of role in language. In doing this kind of research, what we ask ourselves is, do these types of functions that these memory systems serve, do they look similar to something going on in language? And what we find is that the relationships between declarative and procedural memory on the one hand look a lot like the relationships between words and rules in language on the other. It's admittedly more complicated than this, but this is the basic idea.